Hello, my name is Don Phillip, and the purpose of this short screen video is to present the results of the 2012 Knowledge Building Survey. Moving to slide 2. The results of the 2012 Knowledge Building Survey are presented as a radiograph, also called a radar plot, because it appears somewhat similar to what is seen on radar screens. Since many of you may not have seen a radar plot before, a little explanation is in order. Slide 2 shows a radar plot that is empty of data. It looks a little bit like a spider's web. Radar plots are used to display multivariate data. These are data sets in which there is more than one outcome for a single question, as was the case in this survey. Radar plots have the origin, the 0 point, in the center, and instead of having two axes at right angles, as is in the case on a typical Cartesian coordinate system, multiple axes radiate out from the origin like spokes from a wheel. All axes are positive, so negative data cannot be displayed on a radar plot. The axes are set, in our case, 13 of them, one for each question, and the average results for the two data sets can be plotted on the appropriate axes, joined by connecting lines. Different colors are used to differentiate the two data sets. We're moving to slide 3. Slide 3 shows the average results from the class. Best practices are plotted in a blue-green color, and innovation approaches are in yellow. The results from question 1 are in the 12 o'clock position, and questions 2 through 13 are presented clockwise around the circle. One caveat in interpreting these results is that the sample size, 7 respondents, was small, and therefore general inferences cannot be made from this data set. However, it's just fine for discussion purposes. So moving to question 1, that's at 12 o'clock, the average value for innovation was 7, and for best practices was approximately 4, a 3-point difference, indicating the respondents clearly preferred an innovative approach for teaching vocabulary. Question 2, on the use of authoritative resources, again, the value for innovation was very close to 7, and for best practices very close to 4, a 3-point difference, indicating a preference for innovation practices. Question 3, responsibility for goals and knowledge advancement. The results for question 3 are more ambiguous, in that best practices at 5.1 and innovation at 5.7 have a difference of 0.6, showing the average preference not very different between current best practices and innovation approaches. Question 4 deals with idea diversity. In the question 4 results, we can see that innovation approaches are preferred at 6.6 over best practices at 3.6, a 3-point difference. Most respondents clearly preferred to allow idea diversity to flower in the classroom. Question 5, assessment. The results for assessment are almost evenly split between the innovation approaches at 5.3 and best practices at 5.1. I would interpret this to mean that while some would like to use innovative approaches to assessment, the curriculum might make this difficult, hence the nearly even split. However, this would be a good point for class discussion, as it's not actually possible to tell this from the numerical results. Question 6, idea advancement. The best practices score for idea advancement was 3.9. The innovation score was 6.7, a difference of 3.2. Indicating a clear preference for the innovation practices and trying to go beyond what is currently known. Question 7, authentic knowledge work. The results for authentic knowledge work are quite close at 6.7 for best practices and 6.1 for innovation approaches, a difference of 0.6. This is the first case in which best practices have been preferred over innovation approaches, although the difference is small. One thing to note is that there is quite a large jump for best practices compared to previous results. As well, this is in conflict with the results for idea diversity and somewhat in conflict with the responsibility for goals and knowledge advancement question. Again, this would be a good point for class discussion. Question 8 involves social processes of knowledge advancement. Regarding the social processes of knowledge advancement, we see again that innovation practices, 6.3, are favored over best practices, 4.7, but not by as large a margin, the difference being 1.6. Question 9. Pervasiveness of higher order thinking and 21st century skills. Question 9 received the strongest support for innovation practices of all the questions, averaging 7.6. Best practices scored lower at 5.3, but the difference of 2.3 is smaller than other results we have seen. And the score for best practices at 5.3 is almost as high as some of the scores we have seen, for example, question 3, where innovation practices dominated. Question 10, synthesis and shared goals. Question 10 is the second question in the survey in which best practices 6.1 was higher than innovation practices 5.9, but the difference of 0.2 is quite small, and these are almost identical results. Question 11, discourse. On question 11, innovation practices 6.9 dominated over best practices 5.1 again. However, the best practices scores was quite high, indicating that there was considerable support for this among the respondents. Question 12, agency. The scores on question 12 for agency were 5.6 for both innovation practices and best practices. This indicates considerable support for both approaches. Question 13, levels of engagement. Innovation practices scoring 6.9 was higher than best practices scoring 5.3, a difference of 1.6, which is not a big difference. Overall, what should be noted here for class discussion is how high the level of support is for both practices, both innovation and best practices, and how often there's a contradiction between the results of one question and other questions. McPherson, in his article Chaos in the Curriculum, 1995, notes that there are often internal contradictions in the curriculum that make it impossible to achieve the stated objectives, and this appears to be the case here too. This would be another good point for class discussion. This ends this short screen video.